So thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to jump right on into the content, the reason you're here. Enough with all the logistics. Let's talk about ROI. Now, the way I'm going to approach this with Jason is we're going to divide this up. I'm going to talk from the perspective of how do we reduce drag in the face of headwinds, talking about the philanthropic environment we are, how programs such as yours are adjusting. Maybe you'll get some thoughts from that, as well as understanding kind of high-level concepts of ROI and how to evaluate organizationally. Then we're going to dive deeper into philanthropic operations with Jason, where he's going to talk through operational considerations and real practically how to calculate ROI using the example of gift processing. So hopefully through all this, you get a good framework to get started. And I'm going to start with reducing drag in the face of headwinds. Now, I'm trying to think of all the buzzwords from Buzzword Bingo right now: unprecedented, COVID, pandemic, all those different words. So what's one that hasn't been used? I haven't heard a lot of headwinds and drag reduction. So this is my attempt to be creative and use a different phrase. I hope you appreciate that. You know, it's a challenge when the concepts become hashtagable words. But let's talk about where we've been. So for most people, around mid-March to mid-April was the big urgent adaptation phase. That's when people were shifting to work from home. Some were prepared for that, some were less so. Emotionally, there's a lot of adaptation. In some of our early discussions, we talked almost like a Maslow's hierarchy. It's hard to focus on self-actualization when we're just trying to eat and have toilet paper. And we saw a heavy level of market sell-off, which is often an emotional reaction by the populace in terms of shareholding. Philanthropy, we saw a big shift to how do we maintain positive relationships in a digital environment? How do we focus our gift priorities on those that resonate around urgent needs or resonate right now when urgent needs are where we're focused? And looking at key disruption, perhaps events being the most disrupted and how that affected sectors differently. Those that were perhaps more dependent on events saw more disruption than others. Following that, probably for the last month or so, dare I say, we've had a semblance of routine. We're perhaps used to the immediate disruption and trying to get work done in the current environment. We're much more focused on recovery. So we have this maybe organizational hit or emotional hit or change nonetheless. How do we recover and get back to a mission focus, a vision focus, if things had distracted us from that? And actually, we've also seen a market buying where the stock markets have kind of reversed course a little bit. Certainly volatile and so forth, but it's a little bit different than a mass sell-off. It was really some growth there. Now, in philanthropy, we're continuing to see great sector variability, where some sectors, depending on their business model and the need for human gathering as core to their mission, had bigger disruption. Others where we might see kind of a ripple effect disruption in terms of it's hit the budget, but perhaps not immediate services. All that said, we're starting to see some early recovery indicators, dare I say. We had predicted it would be a top-down recovery. We've already seen, as mentioned in previous webinars, Fast Company had posted that article saying the US billionaires had actually grown by $280 billion over the last month. And we're also seeing beyond the billionaires, the high net worth, even a little bit lower than that, are starting to show signs that they're doing, dare I say, okay. Now that's and of one, some not so, some more so. And organizations are probably more in a practical budget headwind right now. And what do I mean by that? So in the face of headwinds, what are these headwinds and what are we seeing around that? The most common is some sort of a hiring freeze, no new hires. And perhaps that if key positions were gone, how do we actually meet those needs? We're seeing some salary cuts or freezes. Many is just, some have just not received the incentive that they would. Some have had really deep cuts. So there's a great variability around among all of you who are attending. So in some cases, even staff reductions. And we've seen that organization-wide to be a little bit more noticeable in the non-revenue areas, or should I say areas that cannot explicitly show their revenue in a very direct way, perhaps have had more reduction, and something that hopefully this webinar helps to address. Certainly lots of evaluating of long-term budget implications, and that varies also by organization type and your funding model. I know some that have certain foundation related funding models, or their budget cycle is rolling, are going to have their bigger budget hit in 2021. I've seen this in some of the public universities, where some of the private schools and the arts it's right now. So there's a great variety in healthcare. It's a shift in terms of perhaps earned revenue from patient care. Even though they're busier than ever, some of the profitable service areas might not be happening at the same extent. And all through this, the one thing that we're seeing as a bright spot is that the development program is generally classified as a revenue recovery area. And it really should be as such, as this is one of our shovels to dig out of disruption. And for the most part, the department writ large has been classified as such. Now within that, the development programs, to maintain that shovel approach, the focus is probably the most heavily, when I talk to different organizations, around 4 key gift priority areas. One is our connection to emergency funds. How do we get money right now for the current situation, or those that are past that urgency? That was at least the initial focus of many. You saw student funds or artist funds and whatnot. But then in terms of recovery, we're seeing the next 3 as being much more common. Outright versus endowed. So perhaps in higher education, if there was a scholarship focus, trying to encourage outright scholarships that can help with the text enrollment for the 2021-2022 class year. Also, we're seeing some adaptation around program and facility. We have to do our programs differently, or our facilities are not equipped for what might be a new normal. How can we adjust our organization and our services that we provide for our community or for the world or for our constituents in new ways? And then the third area is unrestricted support. Really, when is that not necessary, but perhaps it's more necessary when we're in moments of changing needs and we need to be able to be adaptable with those funds. So if those are the shifting gift priorities, an alignment to those is really key from a ROI perspective, and we'll dig into that. So if we're focused on organizational ROI, we want to think about where is it really tough and where is it, maybe easy is not the right word, but easier. So in a relative speaking, it's perhaps an easier case to say development's important. It's an essential revenue generating area. I know some have focused on the cost to raise $1 and reframing that as return on investment right there, which is an important thing. It's very strange that among business units, we're the ones that refer to ourselves as a cost, where others refer to themselves as a return. But are we a 300 or 400% return per dollar, or is it a cost to raise $1? Is one aspect of how organizations have gone about doing that. And also pointing out, as budget and CFO and finance people are often very focused on the denominator. How do we reduce expenses? Sales in a company is focused on how do we increase revenue, and those two are often butting heads. If we decrease costs, do we also decrease sales? In development, a cut to the denominator is also a cut to the numerator, meaning if actually it's 4-to-1 what we bring in versus the cost, a cut down to the bottom affects the 4 as well as the 1. And so we're having a little bit easier time, I'm hearing from folks, from a big picture and also from the front line. So the frontline fundraisers, people directly meeting with an individual and closing a gift. That activity is somewhat easy to define, but for most people from a budget perspective, there's not really a full understanding of what goes into that gift that was just closed, how those prospects are found, how we prioritize who to see, how do we track and report on that gift, how do we make sure that that gift is acknowledged, the donor relations aspect, all those pieces that if they're not doing that, who else is going to do those pieces, and the distractibility quotient. And then third, the importance of unrestricted support generation might give some protection to areas such as annual and direct response and direct marketing, because dollar per dollar, it's a higher amount of flexible use dollars. Those are perhaps on the easier side to make. What might be a little bit more difficult for you is, how do we classify every part of this development program as being truly essential? How about those areas that this staff person doesn't have dollar signs in terms of returns directly attributable to their name. How do we quantify that amount? And really, how do we value the supporting infrastructure? So research, our systems, our events work that might be the coordination aspect. How are all of these areas valued in terms of how that supports that numerator? And then also operational continuity. What cuts or adjustments do we make now that will hamstring us from being able to climb out of the current situation? So sort of the cut the nose off to spite the face concept of operational continuity. When we focus on organizational ROI, oftentimes we're stressed about the lower parts and maybe a little bit more comfortable on the top. So one thing that I like to do as kind of a starting point is with every department, every program area across development, I want to connect it to probably 5 main buckets. How does this contribute to our revenue returns? How does it contribute to alleviating risk? How does this enable continuity? What's the versatility and adaptability of the staff and the functions within this area? And where might there be outsourcing opportunities? So from a revenue returns, how might this area contribute to emergency funds, recovery, long-term? That you're probably doing already. Perhaps more emphasis is on emergency and recovery. But if we don't think about long-term, what might have a ripple effect in the future? What if we're not putting the attention now, it's gonna cause our recovery to not come back as quickly later. Now, I know my internet connection is unstable. I'm getting a little flash sign, so Jason, feel free to jump in if it drops altogether. My apologies, everybody. Now, from a risk management perspective, there's risks to the revenue if this doesn't happen. Certain areas that we might not think about it, but in most businesses, there's a concept of risk, which is a part of the cost, not just the expense. And certain departmental areas might help manage risk. One of those most common risks is distraction to revenue generating activities. If this person can do something that a fundraiser would have to do if they're not here, that takes away from the amount of time they can spend raising money. So that'll actually decrease their revenue potential. So connecting in terms of the distraction effect. Thirdly, there's the concept of continuity. How will we recover without this? This function is going to be key for us to do X, Y, Z moving forward. And then the versatility and adaptability. Now, I've seen this even beyond development programs. I mentioned on a webinar around strategic planning adjustments that a nonprofit that that I was talking to actually had deputized non-fundraising staff to help with research and donor relations tasks because they're so important right now. We need to find anyone who might be potential to give, so from a prospect research perspective, and we need help making more touch points, thank you calls, kind of well visits, if for lack of a better term, with our prospects. And everyone can call and say thank you. And certain people with certain skill sets can be trained to do prospect research if we give access to the tools. That's just one example, but are there some very versatile people within the organization or departments that based on similar skill sets can help with areas where we might be short-staffed because of either hiring freezes or previous reductions? And then fifthly, outsourcing opportunities is especially important if you're unable to fill positions. Are there ways that we can gap fill through outsourcing? I mention this because that's probably one of the most common requests we're getting right now, more than we ever have, is can someone step in and help us manage our annual fund right now? Or can you do prospect research for us? Or can you jump in to help manage our operations team? Or key areas that until we hire somebody, we have critical work that needs to be done. So having each department manager go through and say, think about what you're doing and how it connects to revenue, how it connects to preventing certain risks, continuity for the organization, where are your areas of versatility and adaptability, and where are areas that we could help outsource greatest need that we're unable to fill at the current moment. Now, from that, let me dig into a little bit more about that distractibility. When I talk about officer enablement, I like to bring it back to the old lowest cost biller concept. If any of you worked in big law or the big consulting and so forth, they have this concept of lowest cost biller. It's unlikely that the partner at the law firm is actually drafting your will. They might have a or someone else that can do it, because if they can do it as well for cheaper, they're going to have the lowest cost person do that work. The other principle of lowest cost biller is the idea of, can someone else do it better at the same price? So if someone can do it cheaper and as well, or they can do better at the same price, we would want to delegate it to somebody else to do that cheaper or better person. And then the third area that's often mentioned is there a way that with a defined process, we could do this at scale? We could have an automated process or workflows that we can do something at scale and reduce either the price or increase the output. And that's something we want to do. Now, as an organically, our industry has looked at least chronologically around the work a fundraiser does. Somehow we've got a big list of people in a database. We have to determine for me to go see. I'm going to add them to my portfolio. I'm going to go cold call or a qualification visit. If I determine it's a good prospect, I cultivate them. I ask them for a gift. And then if they give, I take them and have a good donor experience management so that they come back again and I can start to cultivate them for the next gift. Now we've looked at all this work and realized that it's really in this middle zone here, which is perhaps the trickiest area to hire for. Someone who's willing to meet someone for the first time, cultivate, and be bold to ask them for a transformational gift is kind of a most expensive activity in development. So organizationally, or really industry-wide, we've started to push at the outside in to kind of isolate that area as specifically development officer work. And the two most notable areas of direct supporting infrastructure to fundraising would be prospect development and donor relations. So how do we process that whole big list? Hopefully data that we're getting more data to determine who are great prospects, capacity, propensity, maybe we're looking at engagement, liquidity of assets, sector resiliency. Those are two things that the analytics team can do at scale with defined processes. That brings the cost down and enables the officer not to worry about that. Prospect research can then take from those lists, this is the best person to go see, and that vetting from pools down to the best person for the right thing at the right time for the right officer can be enabled by a lower cost process. Officers often don't have the skill sets or the ability to devote the time to this, so we've built up the prospect research profession. Increasingly, we've seen the assignment protocol also lean into prospect management offices, direct prospect management to help assign and make sure we have portfolio health and performance against those portfolios, which is monitoring and helping to support throughout this process. Of course, all of these areas are supporting during the process, but then after the fact, even though the fundraiser may always be in a position of stewarding that gift to someone, we've been able to look at some of that workload and offload that to donor relations, where donor relations can help acknowledge, recognize, maintain a really good donor experience, provide information, reporting, and so forth. Now, these investments have brought scale, better at the same price, and in some cases cheaper ways to enable officers to have a higher return on investment. It's one of the next layers that's the most easy case to make from an officer enablement perspective. Now, the other way that I might look at it or suggest looking is from a pipeline perspective, because one of the most common returns on organizational spend is some sort of a yield rate. Now, it might be yield against asks, it might be yield against prospects, or yield against the overall database capacity. So perhaps you've done a capacity analysis and your whole database is worth X. Well, how do we get to that top line dollar amount? We've had to acquire data. We've had to build data to help us evaluate. We've had to build a list. We've had to build this constituency so we can determine and maximize the top line capacity value. Now, if our ROI is the yield against that, let's say we raise 5% of organizational capacity in a 5-year period, that means 95% went someplace else. After we have a total value, usually the next chronological segment is some sort of researching, and I might lump in together how we might filter with analytics as well as prospect research, but the time and bandwidth of determining who to verify is a cost. We're not going to try to research all 100% of the database. Once we do that, only some names are verified through. And once those verified, we determine how to assign those names forward. Now, everyone who's verified might not be assigned, and even when they're signed, the officer might not take them. So there's a cost associated with our assignment protocol. We might have gone from 100% of our database down to even 10% in this step. So it's not to scale. And it might take another 2% off of that capacity here. Once we roll them out, not every person's going to take a first visit or a cold call. There's a cost of achieving that discovery call, which I would call discovery attainment. Let's say that we are only able to get visits in 1 in 5. Suddenly that percent drops down to 20% of whatever it was at the step above. If post a discovery call, we find out that that was the wrong name, we have a misaligned identification, which means our criteria didn't align with necessarily those that would be good prospects, and that's an area of tuning. Then the fundraiser steps in, really, although they stepped in on the discovery call, to the cultivation. What's their strategy for how much they're planning to ask? If that's less than their capacity, that's a reduction. When they actually make the ask, and then when they close the gift, those all might be numbers that are slightly lower, so that when we get to this top, lower 5%, there was 95% of reduction that happened. And I would argue that actually the majority, even if as much as 75 to 90% of the reduction, actually happens pre-gift officer. So increasing our assignment protocol, our research bandwidth, and our conversion in these early stages will have a ripple effect in increasing our yield rate. So that's another method. So I talked about officer enablement. The other one is to look at the direct effect of the work on from a long-term perspective. Even though research isn't dollars right now, our being able to research a higher value means more that will go into the pipeline to be asked and result in an ultimate higher yield rate against the original denominator that we're starting from. So connecting tasks to revenue returns, that's another example of how that might be done. And one last thing before I turn it over to Jason is also thinking about things that might not have been in your budget before, but are key to recovery. Some of the innovations, one of the easiest to think about is the new digital tools for major gift officers. That's something that we've had to invest in and to equip them and to train them, and how can we be better as a gift officer, even though that might not have been in the budget. How do we adjust our events to be virtual or meetups? Student digital teams, perhaps right now, depending on your calling program, you're not able to do student calls if you're a school. We found a lot of success with organizations that have really equipped students to be their ambassadors. We've seen huge growth in student digital teams in the last month or so. Increase video production so that our content in our current environment is accessible. And then also deputizing staff for increased research and donor relations. Similar to the example I gave a few minutes ago, it doesn't necessarily need to be non-development staff, but think about other deputizing areas where someone's role might be different right now. So this might be either adjustable or enhanced resources because they're necessary for us to climb back out. So hopefully that's a good high level on the headwinds, some principles, ways to think of it from a task and an enablement perspective. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jason to dig in deeper onto considerations from a philanthropy operations perspective. So Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. Before we dive in here, I thought I would remind folks that if they, and I saw a question come in, but if you do have questions for myself or Josh, you can put those in the Q&A section here, and we'll get to those as we go throughout the presentation or at the end. And I appreciate operations being integrated into this presentation, because it can be a little bit harder to justify ROI on the operations side of the house, which is where I specialize. And so we wanted to give a few tactical examples of how that functions, in addition to Josh's example from prospect development earlier. So before we do that, I want to start off with some things that outside considerations for calculating ROI. In particular, this first slide here is how when not to be calculating ROI. So what we don't want to do first and foremost is dive into ROI based off anecdotes. So we don't want to falsely justify projects or when we start talking about does this have ROI to our organization. So an example, there's 4 of them there, but a good example that all of us have probably encountered is a VIP gets upset. So all of a sudden we've got to tackle some project, right? Well, what we don't know, what that presupposes, there's some underlying systematic project that needs to be undertaken to fix something, and that's going to involve resources and needs to have a cost justification to it. But it could also very well be that instance is an outlier, and we need to do some deeper digging there before we determine one way or the other. So first and foremost is having projects well defined is kind of an underlying theme before we get into this. So again, donations being logged incorrectly, direct mail being too expensive, troubles logging on. These could be systemic problems that need to have project definitions and resources, but they also may be outliers, and so it's up to the operational professionals to well define or define well those projects before we get into them. Because one thing that we don't want to do is undertake, because resources are so precious these days, is have them focused unwisely. And many times, you know, nothing's wrong until something goes catastrophically wrong. So we want to be proactive about our project prioritization rather than chasing the fires of the day. Go ahead, Josh. Some consideration for operational areas that kind of override all of these, and you'll hear me talk a little bit later about tangible versus intangible benefits, and this starts to get into that. For the 4 areas we traditionally define in operations, we've got gift processing, prospect development, stewardship, and IT. So each of these have distinct considerations to them. So for gift processing, we need to keep in mind that it's a critical organization of the gateway. It's a very reactional area, which means that we can't proactively give a gift processor a goal on how many gifts to process, because they don't control that, right? They're beholden to the amount of information that comes into the organization. So that's one challenge that we get into when measuring a gift processing activity. There's also a need for, even though we want to highly standardize gift processing, we also have to keep it personal. So there's tangible and intangible things here. And many times customer service is rolled into the gift processing area. But gift processing at the end of the day is also one of the prime areas where outsourcing is possible. So it's going to be a likely suspect if we are under resource constraints. Same with prospect development, a lot of outsourcing possibilities there. The processes, as Josh mentioned earlier, are highly defined and replicatable. And they have a high visible impact on the fundraising cycle. So prospect development can be very visible in the organization. And if our pipelines are low, then we can directly see the impact of having poor prospect development workflows. And they're also highly dependent on vendor tools. Stewardship is a little bit more difficult to start looking at ROI because it's, again, more intangible benefits, very important, but the direct impact there is not, it's not as cause and effect as it is in some of our other areas like gift processing. So I always say gift stewardship is difficult for organizations because you can throw an infinite amount of resources into stewardship, and those resources would probably be well spent. But we have to draw the line somewhere and justify those expenses. And outsourcing and stewardship is obviously difficult. And then IT, it gets even more difficult. These are highly technical processes. It's difficult sometimes to translate these things to upper management and justify those costs. But we do want to, I think when you're talking about IT, and we won't talk about it a lot in this presentation, but we do want, it is important to look at IT as an aggregate total of different priority projects rather than looking at the headcount of the entire IT department as a whole. IT department as a whole is often seen as bloated, and there's questions about it, but by having each project that the IT staff is working on well defined and having the ROI outlaid, that helps justify those expenses. So let's move on to the next slide where we talk about just a sample project ROI assessment. So again, very important to just have a methodology behind it. It's not super complicated what we're trying to do here, but first and foremost, we need to define well the problem. So what is the problem? So just an example here is this is a very simple problem where we have a lot of missing or employer information in our database. So that is the problem. But what we don't often do from that is we know there's a problem, but we don't often ask what the business impact is of that problem. And that's where you get into being able to start to calculate your specific ROI. So The ramifications of missing job titles, for instance, could be that we're unable to identify our largest employers. We're unable to make key connections. We're unable to identify potential projects. So once we start to identify the specific business impact, then we can start to quantify those things. So what are some quantifications we can make out of that, those identified problems? Well, we know we're missing prospects, and we know we're missing lost business engagement opportunities. So we can begin to start to add quantifiable dollar amounts to those. Not in every case, but in a lot of cases, we can start to guesstimate or actually assign specific numerical values to those lost opportunities. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do here in this methodology. So moving on, if we are able to calculate specific dollar amounts, then calculating your return on investment is actually quite easy. You assess the benefit, and you know the cost to mitigate the benefit, which can often be easy, or it can be a little bit harder to come up with that mitigation cost. Say if you're looking at like a whole new CRM system or something, that can be a huge mitigation cost. But the ROI is simply the benefit minus the cost, and that gives you your return on investment. So the more we are able to quantify those specific costs and benefits, the better off we are in being able to come up with specific ROI dollars for the initiatives that we're trying to achieve in the organization. So let's dig into an example of that. Again, a really simple one on the next slide where we have some hard numbers assigned to it. So this is something we may encounter in a marketing activity where we're trying to come up with what is the value of our revenues per subscriber. So if we have an annual revenue, say an email marketing initiative, and that the revenue from that marketing email initiative brings in usually $1 million, okay? And how many valid deliverable subscribers did we deliver to? 25,000 in this case. So from that, we can derive that by taking $1 million divided by 25,000, we've got about $40 that we can then attribute to each one of those valid subscribers. So how can I use this information? Well, then I know if I'm trying to attain additional emails, which has a cost attributed to it, we can do that through screening, we can do it through other independent vendor sources. I begin to quantify how valuable my email addresses are in my database. In this case, $40 a pop. So then I can go out and I can get the cost of the project may be email attainment, and the cost versus the potential newly returned email addresses will give me a potential revenue off of that for this particular scenario. So this gives you just a general idea, a very vague, kind of a beginner level entry point to calculating ROI with specific hard numbers. But and sometimes it is fairly easy to do this. So if we go to the next slide here, there's a couple of points that I want to make off of this. So just a couple other examples. And again, calculating ROI isn't always this easy, but for the purposes of this demonstration or this webinar, we'll look at a couple of easily assumptions here. So we've got, in this case, the problem is the missing wealth information in our database. The issue is we can't identify prospects. And so what is a mitigation issue to that? Well, we can do a wealth screening, very common activity in fundraising. So from that, we can begin to, in this case, we've estimated, and your vendors can sometimes help you come up with this potential impact cost. In this case, it's $1 million, and they're coming up with that by, oftentimes you'll send them a test file and they'll send you a test back and they say, we found this many percentage missing people that we could append a data to worth this much money, and we estimate that with these efforts you can raise X amount of money off of that. And oftentimes it's an impressively large amount of money. So if we estimate that we can mitigate or we can have an impact cost of $1 million on the organization for a $75,000 well screening project, then our potential ROI is almost really $1 million off of that project. So once you start to do that, you can start to get some very tangible dollar amounts against your projects that you're trying to undertake. But not only that, if we look at the second example, or I've got some incorrect gift entry and I'm attributing that to poorly trained staff. So I want to have a training opportunity that's valued at $15,000, but I'm estimating that that $15,000 training opportunity can actually mitigate about $500,000. Now, in this case, I'm directly attributing that to one example where I had some messed up data on one VIP record, but there are different ways of coming up to that impact cost, but I can attribute that to a $485,000 potential return on investment. So a couple valuable things from this kind of exercise is that, one, you can begin again to assign potential ROI, which is a language that a lot of your executive staff will speak and appreciate you doing in trying to come up with justifying budget expenses. But secondly, and something that's very important, especially in the information technology area, is once I've done this, then I can begin to prioritize my projects and my potential budget expenses by actual dollar amount. So I immediately see that there's a potential higher ROI based on this project than there is on the second project. So that may, it may not be the only consideration, but it's going to be an important consideration in depending on how many dollars I have to spend. I may want to prioritize the $75,000 expense over this $15,000 expense. So let's move on to the next slide. And again, I mentioned earlier tangible versus intangible benefits and expenses. So this is where things start to get gray, because calculating ROI is not always about, we would love for it to be always about the dollars. But the fact of life is it's not always about the dollars, and there's gray areas and there's intangible benefits to every project, every position that we're trying to talk about in terms of ROI. And this gets even harder when we're talking about human assets. But an example, I wanted to give a real quick example of just looking at a potential CRM conversion. Do we need a new database? And we know from our benchmarking at BWF that there's lots of institutions looking at database conversions, and we're helping a lot of institutions with that assessment and these kind of ROI calculations. And these are the kind of things we look at. If we want to look at, again, tangible expenses and benefits that we can assign a dollar amount to, these are the easy ones: licensing fees, labor on the project, server administration costs. A lot of times, you know, if you're moving to a cloud, that changes that variable. Security compliance and security, well, the mitigation related to what you're spending on now versus what you could do going to the cloud. Authentication, these are things that we can easily attach dollar amounts to. But some things that we can't so easily attach dollar amounts to include the overall user experience. How do you place a dollar amount on? We know it's important, but placing a dollar amount on that can be very difficult. Touch point tracking, I want to get those 360, those holistic touch point views of our constituents. Extremely important. What is the dollar benefit of that? Improved data integrity tools, retraining existing staff as an expense. These are all things where we may have to do some further digging to, and in many cases, it's impossible to define or assign specific dollar amounts to them. So we have to balance the dollar amounts with our intangible benefits or expenses at the same time. So let's look at a quick example of that. And this is the example that I'm going to end on. Just in terms of, earlier Josh looked at prospect development. I'm going to shift gears and look at gift processing. So this, what I've done here is, and I think that the first step into doing this effectively with any organization, when you're talking about ROI, especially if you're talking about a process that is completed by humans, that we're potentially looking again at outsourcing, we need to do a business process analysis to make sure to carefully define each step of the process so that we know where the potential outsourcing or mitigation points are. So that's what I've done on this slide, is I've taken gift processing and I've broken it down into all its kind of step areas. So again, we start at processing, then we enter the demographic information, we enter the actual gift into the system. We may have document imaging assigned with that. verification and validation, posting, depositing, receipt, and acknowledgement. If you are a manager of gift processing or oversee this area, these are all going to be very familiar steps to you. Now, what I will also say is that each one of these steps, for the most part, is something that can be outsourced. And we call that, there's two different strategies that you can take for that. You can outsource to lock boxes and or caging vendors. Lock boxes like a bank that will open and process and deposit the mail to you very easily, and then usually passes it off to you to do some more processing. Caging facilities will actually pretty much manage everything from the beginning process step all the way to the acknowledgement if you choose. And so it can be a very holistic outsourcing process. There are pros and cons to each of these. And let's dig into this a little bit easier or a little bit deeper if I'm a manager and I'm looking at this particular business process. So let's jump ahead to the next slide. I've assigned sort of one way that I can look at this in terms of what is it costing me to do this in-house? Well, if I've got a full-time gift processor that's making $35,000 a year, and I'm totally making these dollar amounts up, but they're not too far off the mark, and that person is entering 50 gifts a day, and they're typically working 261 working days a year. That's how many working days we've got in the year, minus maybe a couple weeks of vacation, hopefully. You're looking at about $2.68 per donation to process. These numbers will vary drastically between institutions. And again, some of this is dependent upon how many donations you bring in for processing. Just to complicate a little bit further, you probably want to bifurcate that into gifts that are brought in online versus gifts that have to be touched by a human being. So we want to look exactly at what the in-house processor is having to touch. But let's say we want to outsource that. Very common thing to do in a lot of nonprofits. I can probably outsource every step on that previous slide for close to about $1.25 minus the postage and handling fees per donation. Let's say that as a ballpark. So if I've got $1.25 per donation, I could potentially take that same 13,050 donations and spend $16,312.50 on them, and therefore I've got a potential cost savings of $18,687.50, which looks pretty good. And for a lot of institutions, that is pretty good. So if you're an institution that is in under immediate resource constraints, it would be silly to say that gift processing isn't someplace that you would hone in on and look at this kind of scenario, because there are very specific benefits for doing this. But, and this is the slide I'm going to end on, we always need to take a holistic view and look at the tangibles and intangibles, the pros and the cons of outsourcing these processes. So I'm going to start on the right-hand side. The pros, we know we're going to save money. It's going to be less expensive. They're going to, a caging or a lockbox facility is typically going to bring specialization and technology utilization and easier compliance to the table, just because that's what they do 24 hours a day. That's their job. They're also scalable to growth or contraction, which is very appealing if you're a seasonal or you know, a lot of seasonal flux in your gift processing flow. But we've also got to look at the negatives of this, and we need to do this in any process we look at. If we do that, we're going to be less adaptable as an organization to complicated donations. So if you've got a lot of or just things that really take a lot of thought to enter, or they're outline scenarios, outsourcing lends itself to highly mechanized or standardized types of donations. So that could be a negative. That is my point too there. Again, it's, if you think of annual mailing where everything is kind of coming in with the same barcode or same business reply envelope, those are the kind of things that really lend themselves well to outsourcing to caging facilities. But also caging facilities can just be viewed as less personal. And that's a big consideration for organizations that are looking at outsourcing gift processing, because A lot of nonprofits just like to, they have a lot of staff that have been there a long time. They're a family, and they want that personal touch. They want on the donations, and it's a very valid thing that you have to think through. But that personal touch has to be balanced against the very real ROI of approaching the outsourcing of that process. So it can get quite complicated, but all of those steps I just kind of run through aggregated should give you a sense of how you can kind of go about approaching a potential project, especially an operational project, and assessing that ROI depending on what scenario you're looking at. I'm going to stop there for questions.
All right. And thank you so much, Jason. And thanks, everybody. I hope this was helpful. Certainly, one webinar is not nearly enough to tackle the concepts that we tried to at least give you some framework. That was really our goal. What are ways that you can address things? I really like the potential ROI calculation with mitigating risk. How do we evaluate different programs in different ways so that we can have those ways that we can be equipped to deal with these in our own way, which makes sense in our culture. Now, we've had some questions come in, and I think we have time to maybe get to 2 or 3 of them. And some of the quick ones were about providing the presentation deck. Absolutely, we will make sure that that's out and available to all of you. So be assured this content is all there for you. One of the questions during my section came in, and I'll address that now, just expand a little bit more on the student digital team examples. Real briefly, these teams are looking at the reality of sometimes the student caller program, which is a great program historically for organizations and still successful at many, mainly in schools. Also taking into context how little, at least I know with my college age kids and high school age kids, how little they actually talk on the phone and how adept they are at social interaction and content distribution and interacting in those environments. And how can we leverage their strengths in a way that's a benefit to our organization? And what we've seen is a lot of organizations shift some portion of their base development spend towards hiring great students that might have influencer capabilities, equipping them to produce content, oftentimes it's video, and distribute that in a social environment while encouraging gifts directly. So rather than a student calling you, you're seeing a video from that student or interaction in a social environment. And we're seeing some cases of those that have shifted that were actually, they're raising as much, if not considerably more in that environment. So that's and certainly I think we actually have another webinar that digs into that a little bit more deeply. If you check out the bwf.com or reach out to us, we can talk more than what we have time to now, but it's a great opportunity. Jason, maybe both of us can try to tackle, I think this one question looks perhaps a little complicated for our time, but looking at best case and worst case scenario for budget forecasts, what are practices for mitigating expectations between both scenarios, mainly when it comes to communicating across the organization with respect to organizational culture? I'll jump in real briefly on it, and Jason, maybe you can fill in some of the gaps. I think with all of these scenarios, it's important to never have our arms up in the air and this is the state we're in, but actually be more thoughtful and thinking of almost an if-then. If this happens, then we would do that. If this happens, we would do this thing. That shows that you've thought through different scenarios. And from those scenarios, it shouldn't be current state to worse. It should be a future growth state down to a reduction state where we're looking across our program. If this happens, this is where we'll invest. If this happens, this is where we'll divest. And one way to do that is to take that initial framework of how we prioritize how each function connects to direct ROI, to say officer enablement, risk management, continuity of service, what are opportunities for outsourcing and so forth, so that we're in a position of, we've run through lots of scenarios and we have a plan. The plan will give more confidence than anything. Jason, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough reality of the current situation, especially. I mean, and we've worked with organizations prior to this, even where it's a tough reality where you've got these kind of issues. And I'll just say, related to the toughest situation, which is always personnel, where there's personalities and feelings involved. What I would encourage any organization that's beginning to kind of look at this is, first and foremost, take your org chart. And I'm assuming we're talking about, again, personnel here. Take your org chart and make a copy of it and take the names off of it and look at functional roles. And this is one thing we do a lot in our line of work is each of those functional roles should make sense in the organization. This can not only apply to an org chart, but it can also be a business process. Does each step of that business process make sense? Because what doesn't make sense is where you need to put your attention to addressing. And if you take the personalities out of that equation, you can look at that more objectively. They can get added in back at the end. You can figure out your mitigation for the personality issues later on in the process, but first figure out where your biggest opportunities are for improvement, both process and personnel wise, and that'll get you the furthest down the road and ready to tackle the really difficult problems with regard to organization, the culture of the organization.
And thank you so much, Jason. And I'm going to call it because we're a little bit over time, but I really can't thank all of you enough for being here, for participating in this webinar. It means so much to us what you do, and it's such a great honor for us to help enable and empower you to be the most successful that you can be. We believe in the essentiality of development, and anything that we can do to power those next practices, we're here. So keep in touch, keep doing what you're doing, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.